XXXY Athletics put this out. This feels very inclusionary. Enes is beginning his beautiful journey. As we all know, total affirmation is the only option. We also know that being a woman is merely a feeling. This is very hateful, and this is in response to this. Shave that fugly beard, spend 3 years doing weekly estrogen injections, and then we'll talk. Oh, so you're telling us that is a threat to women's sports was never from trans women.
That exchange online shows how quickly the argument can move from discussing policy to making personal attacks. One side mocks Freedom's declaration by saying he would need to medically transition before the conversation could be taken seriously. The response from the source is that if male athletes are allowed to compete in women's categories, then the concern exists regardless of their motivation. But motivation is another area where these debates often become confusing. You cannot responsibly claim that every transgender athlete enters women's sports because they want to dominate women. That assumes the same intention for a large and diverse group of people without evidence. Different athletes have different motivations, circumstances, and identities. The competitive question does not require making that accusation. You can debate fairness using measurable standards, eligibility rules, hormone requirements if they exist, performance differences, research from sports organizations, competitive results, and the way a league defines its competition category. The argument becomes weaker, not stronger, when it depends on assuming bad intentions. The other side has a similar responsibility. If someone raises a legitimate question about competitive categories, automatically calling them hateful avoids the actual issue. That is why these public debates often go nowhere. People make moral judgments before they even agree on the policy being discussed. Freedom's stunt takes advantage of that perfectly. He creates an intentionally extreme example. Critics respond to the provocation. Supporters then point to the emotional reaction as evidence that the policy cannot handle scrutiny. Everyone ends up arguing about the reaction instead of looking at the actual rules. That cycle can continue forever. The only way out is to be specific. What are the eligibility requirements? Who enforces them? Are the rules publicly available? Do they differ from international basketball standards? Are they based on sex, gender identity, medical criteria, league discretion, or some combination of these factors? And most importantly, would Freedom actually qualify under those standards? Until the relevant authority answers those questions, anyone claiming that the issue is already completely settled in either direction is getting ahead of the available evidence.
White, right here, revealing his hair. Revealing his hair. Why can't people on the left be more supportive? All this hatred is making my transition that much more difficult. I've already had to deal with white supremacy, and now this too.
Royce White then uses the same strategy through parody, pretending that he is transitioning and accusing his opponents of being unsupportive. Again, the goal is clear: force supporters of gender self-identification to consider what would happen if someone tried to use that framework in bad faith. This is an old political strategy. Take a principle, push it to an extreme example, and ask whether the people defending that principle would still accept the result. But good policy is designed to handle bad faith situations. Eligibility rules should not be written with the assumption that every applicant is acting sincerely. Instead, they should use clear and objective standards that can be applied regardless of whether officials like the person, trust the person, or agree with their politics. That is the deeper reason this stunt matters. If WNBA eligibility depends on subjective judgments about someone's sincerity, intentions, or identity, a political provocateur can make the system look arbitrary. If eligibility depends on clear, objective criteria, the league can simply apply those rules. That is the main issue underneath all the memes. Freedom and White are not really testing whether they can play professional women's basketball. They are testing whether the WNBA has a rule that can be explained in one clear sentence when someone deliberately tries to challenge it. That is a much harder test than the memes make it seem. If the league passes that test, the story will probably fade quickly. If it cannot, the issue could keep coming back whenever another political activist submits paperwork, appears at an event, or publicly challenges the wording of the rules. That is why I would pay more attention to what the WNBA does next than to whatever the latest viral account posts.
Wow. Wow. This is getting real, Kathy Engelberg. Do you know what as you're in the locker room, Kathy Engelberg to talk to players,
Now the source turns toward Commissioner Kathy Engelbert and imagines what it would look like if this controversy followed league leadership directly into player spaces. The joke is exaggerated, but the pressure on the commissioner is real because league commissioners exist for moments like this. Coaches should focus on coaching. Players should not have to become policy experts every time a reporter asks a politically sensitive question. The league office is the one that can clearly say, this is the rule. This is why it exists. This is how it applies. And if the current rule is being reviewed, the commissioner's office can say that too. That kind of clarity would protect everyone involved. It would protect women players from having every press conference taken over by culture war questions. It would protect transgender athletes from having their eligibility reduced to jokes about former NBA players. It would protect teams from giving inconsistent answers, and it would protect the league from creating the impression that eligibility rules change depending on which political side is asking the question. That is the real institutional issue. This is bigger than whether Freedom's announcement makes people laugh or makes them angry. Professional sports leagues depend on legitimacy. Fans accept results because they believe rules are established before controversies happen and are applied consistently when those controversies arrive. Once people start believing that rules are being created or changed because of outside pressure, trust can disappear quickly. That applies to officiating, discipline, contracts, and especially to who is eligible to compete. So if you strip this controversy down to its most important question, it is not whether Enes Freedom deserves a WNBA roster spot. There is no evidence that any WNBA team plans to draft him. The real question is whether the WNBA can explain its eligibility rules clearly enough that a political stunt cannot create genuine confusion. That is the standard. And subscribing is worth it if you want to follow what the league actually says rather than just the loudest reactions, because the next phase depends entirely on whether an official response arrives.
I think I can hear Cheryl Reeve and Natalie Nakaska and Stephanie Whitehead. You can literally hear their heads exploding. Big Trouble in Little China style.
The source closes by predicting that coaches around the WNBA will hate having this issue dropped into their laps. And on that point, I understand why. Imagine preparing for a game, dealing with rotations, injuries, scouting, travel, and playoff positioning, and then suddenly having your press conference turn into a debate about gender eligibility because two former NBA players launched a political stunt online. That is not a normal basketball question, but it becomes one when the league's own rules are being questioned. Now we can finally close the loop from the beginning. Freedom's declaration matters less as a basketball move and more as a pressure campaign. There is no verified evidence in this source that the WNBA has accepted him into the 2027 draft pool, approved him as eligible, or that any team is interested in selecting him. Those claims should not be invented. What is real is that he publicly announced the declaration, showed what he says is formal paperwork dated August 6, and generated enough attention that a WNBA coach was asked about the issue during a media appearance. That is already a result for him. The stunt moved from social media into the league's press environment. Now the WNBA has the ball, and there are really three ways this can go. The league can point to an existing rule that clearly answers the question. That would be the cleanest outcome. The league can clarify or change its policy, which would suggest that the stunt identified a real area of uncertainty. Or the league can avoid giving a detailed public explanation, which would likely allow Freedom, Royce White, political commentators, advocacy groups, and critics on the other side to keep defining the issue for them. None of these outcomes require pretending that the offensive jokes in the source are insightful. They are not necessary to make the policy argument. They also do not require pretending that every transgender athlete is the same as a former NBA player making a sarcastic declaration. That comparison is intentionally extreme. And none of this requires pretending that competitive fairness is an illegitimate subject. Women's sports leagues have every reason to define who their competition category is for, and fans have every right to ask what those definitions are. The fair standard is consistency. Write the rule, apply the rule, explain the rule, and then let people debate whether they agree with it. That is much healthier than forcing coaches to improvise answers while social media turns every facial expression into evidence for one side or the other. This also exposes something about modern sports media that has become impossible to ignore. The actual game is only one part of the story now. Around it are politics, identity, law, branding, labor relations, social media, sponsorships, and activism. One viral declaration can move from X to a press conference faster than a league can prepare its talking points. That means silence is no longer always neutral. Sometimes silence is the responsible choice for an individual coach who does not control league policy. But institutional silence leaves a vacuum, and that vacuum gets filled by whoever has the biggest platform and the strongest narrative. Freedom understands that. Royce White understands it. The activists responding to them understand it. And the WNBA needs to understand it too, because the league is entering a period where its growth makes every controversy bigger. More viewers mean more scrutiny. More money means more legal attention. More cultural relevance means more groups trying to use the league as a battleground for issues that go far beyond basketball. That is the price of becoming more important. A small league can sometimes survive confusion because only the most dedicated fans notice. A league seeking major national relevance cannot. Every policy becomes a precedent. Every non-answer becomes a headline. Every inconsistency gets clipped, compared, reposted, and used in the next argument. So this is not just about freedom. If another person tests the same boundary next month, the answer should be the same. If an actual prospective player raises an eligibility issue next season, the league should already know the process. If lawmakers, sponsors, or player representatives ask for clarification, they should not receive different answers depending on who is asking. That is how durable sports governance works. And there is another reason clarity protects the players. WNBA athletes should not be expected to personally solve every social conflict connected to their league. They may have strong opinions. Some will speak and some will not. But league policy should not depend on whether a star player gives the right answer after practice. When the rules are clear, players can simply say that the issue is governed by league policy and move on. When the rules are unclear, every player suddenly becomes part of the controversy whether she wants to be or not. That is unfair to them. So while the internet is focused on the outrageous version of this story, former NBA players making draft declarations and jokes about scoring 57 points a night, the serious version is much simpler. The WNBA is being challenged to define a boundary. And once that boundary is challenged publicly, you cannot solve the problem with vibes. You need clear language, a clear process, and consistency. That is why the no comment clip was more important than all the trolling that came before it. It showed that the question had reached people inside the league ecosystem before a definitive public answer was ready. Maybe the league already has a completely clear answer internally. If so, this should be easy. Maybe there are eligibility rules that the source video is ignoring or oversimplifying. If so, publish them and correct the record. Maybe the policy is changing. If so, explain the process. But the worst option is allowing everyone to argue from assumptions. One side will say freedom exposed a loophole. The other will say the entire premise is nonsense. Meanwhile, millions of viewers in the middle will have no idea which claim is actually supported by the rules. That is not sustainable. There is also a strategic lesson here for Freedom himself. If his goal is to advocate for sex-based protections in women's sports, the strongest argument comes from focusing on policy language, competitive standards, and real evidence. The more the campaign turns into insulting jokes about women or transgender people, the easier it becomes for critics to dismiss the entire thing as harassment instead of engaging with the eligibility question. Critics of freedom face the same choice. If they believe the existing policy is fair, explain why it is fair. Explain the safeguards. Explain where the hypothetical does not apply. Do not rely only on calling the stunt offensive, because offensiveness and policy validity are two different questions. That is how you actually move the discussion forward: facts first, rules second, politics after that. And if the WNBA does give a definitive answer, that answer should be judged by the same standard regardless of which side likes it. Is it clear? Is it enforceable? Is it consistent? Does it protect the integrity of the competition? And can the league apply it without improvising every time a new controversy appears? That is the real test Freedom's stunt has created. Not whether people laughed. Not whether people were offended. Not whether one coach looked uncomfortable. The real question is whether the rule can survive contact with a deliberately provocative hypothetical. So now I want you to choose between the two positions. Did Enes Freedom expose a genuine policy weakness that the WNBA now needs to clarify? Or is this simply a political stunt being treated as a bigger eligibility crisis than it really is? Tell me which one you think it is. Subscribe if you want the follow-up when the league responds.